Okay, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here at our Normative Orders cluster. I'm Rainer Forst, and together with my dear friend Klaus Günther, co-directors here of our research center. It's a great pleasure to introduce it to you briefly, because I know you all came to hear him speak briefly, Professor Daniel Ziblatt, who we're very happy to have with us tonight. He is the Eaton Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard, where he's also a resident faculty associate of the Minda de Günzburg Center for European Studies and at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. I don't need to tell you much about his research, because you all know that he is one of the foremost experts on the analysis of democracy, its fate today, as well as its long-term development from the past century. He also studies the development of political parties. He's an expert in political economy and always centered on Europe and European societies, even though his latest book and also the talk today will center less on Europe and more on the United States and the fate of democracy in that lovely country. So his book, co-authored with Steven Levitsky, on How Democracies Die, is a big hit, has been translated in a great many languages, 15, Daniel, 16, well, one more by the day, including German. You can see it outside, Wie Demokratien sterben und was wir dagegen tun können. Was just published by the Deutsche Verlagsanstalt. It was awarded the NDR Kultur Sachbuchpreis, which brought Daniel over here just 2 weeks ago, and we're very grateful to him that he made another trip across the Atlantic to be here with us. He does not just reflect on how democracies die or could die. He also reflects on the birth of democracy, which is a part of the title of the book he published not long ago with Cambridge 2017. The complete title is Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. Much acclaimed book, won a number of awards by the American Political Science and the American Sociological Association. His first book was called Structuring the State, the Formation of Italy and Germany and the Puzzle of Federalism, which grew out of the PhD at Berkeley. So he received his PhD at Berkeley, but has been teaching at Harvard for the past 15 years, where he also co-chairs with Steve Levitsky a research cluster. Well, we all know how great research clusters are, on new challenges to democracy. He's been a visiting fellow at a great many universities, including the EUI in Florence, Sciences Po, and also at German universities, like the Department of History at Ludwig Maximilians University. He also speaks excellent German. He will present his talk in English, but we can also have German questions later on. Daniel, it's great to have you here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Ich würde es gerne auf Deutsch machen, aber es geht bei uns alle besser, wenn ich das auf Englisch mache. Aber wir können auch nachher Fragen auf Deutsch machen, wenn wir wollen. It's really wonderful to have an opportunity to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to coming here for quite a while. We tried to come in June. We were trying to organize a trip in June, so it's really nice to be here today and to talk about the book that I've written with Steve Levitsky's How Democracies Die. So the question that we ask in our book, and the question that I want to talk about tonight, is a critical question. And that question is democracy genuinely in danger in the United States? Now, this is a question, I have to admit, I never thought I would ask. There was good reason to think that I shouldn't ask this question. In general, rich, old democracies don't die. The social science literature is really quite clear on this. The richer a democracy is, the older a democracy is, the less likely a democracy is to die. And yet, the election of President Trump in 2016 in the past year and a half to 2 years has really left us in a situation in the United States where many people are beginning to think we're in uncharted terrain. In his classic 1978 book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, Juan Linz, the great Spanish political scientist who for many years taught at Yale University, devised what he called as a litmus test, and to identify authoritarian leaders before they come into office. The idea was maybe there's some kind of early warning system that we can use to identify authoritarians before they get into office. So he proposed this in 1978. In our book, we offer a refined version of this test. And it turns out in 2015, 2016, before assuming the presidency, candidate Trump tested unambiguously positive on this litmus test. He checked all the boxes. He suggested he might not abide by the results of elections. He threatened legal action against his political opponent and threatened to lock up his political opponent. He had threatened legal action against the media, and he encouraged and, in fact, condoned violence at his political rallies. So whatever one thinks of President Trump and candidate Trump, many people say his bark is worse than his bite. He's in some ways a traditional Republican. But what is true is that no major party presidential candidate in American history had ever behaved this way before. But Steve, my co-author, and I had seen politicians behave this way in the past and in other parts of the world. So me and my research in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, and Steve on his research in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. So we watched the campaign. We're colleagues. We work together. We see each other every day. As we watched the campaign in 2015, 2016, we really had this feeling that we had seen this before. And we knew it usually doesn't end well. So we decided we really needed to write this book to try to draw lessons from other countries around the world and other points in history where countries had faced this kind of crisis and where countries had overcome these kinds of crises and other places where they hadn't, to try to extract some lessons for the United States. So again, the question is American democracy in danger? I'm going to just jump straight to my punchline, and then I'll talk about why I come to this conclusion. When we think about the state of American democracy, when Americans do in particular, and I think more generally, there's a kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, some people, especially in light of the midterm elections that just took place in November, some people think that the American system of checks and balances, the Madisonian design, is kicking in and it's working. So we shouldn't be too worried. And I think lots of people breathed a collective sigh of relief in the November elections. On the other hand, some believe that Donald Trump, with his weak commitment to democratic norms, is such a fundamental threat to democracy that really this is so unprecedented that perhaps tyranny is genuinely around the corner. I disagree with both of these views. I am worried about the state of American democracy, but not because of, or at least not only because of Donald Trump. I think the problems lay elsewhere, and I want to talk about those problems this evening. So I'll come back to that. But I would like to start at the beginning, though. The title of the book is Wie Demokratien sterben. So, wie stirbt Demokratien? The first point I would make is that democracies don't die like they used to. So democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns. During the Cold War, we calculate that three-quarter of democratic breakdowns happen in the form of military coups. So tanks in the streets, airplanes flying overhead. It was vivid. It was clear when a democracy was dying. Contemporary democracies, since the end of the Cold War, die in much more subtle ways. They die at the hands not of generals, but of presidents and prime ministers, leaders who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert democracy. So democracies today often die constitutionally, through elections, through referenda, through parliamentary decisions, through court rulings. As a result of this, many citizens often aren't fully aware that democracy is dying until it's too late. So to give you one example, in 2011, 12 years into Hugo Chávez's presidency, a survey was done, and a majority of Venezuelans, according to the survey, said they still lived in a democracy. I think there's similar dynamics at work today in Turkey, in Hungary as well. So if democratic breakdown now begins at the ballot box, one of the keys to protecting democracy in this new form in which democracies die, one of the keys is keeping extremists and demagogues out of power. And this is where political parties enter the story. They play a really decisive role. We often don't think about it this way, but it turns out political parties are democracy's gatekeepers. I forget what the German translation of this is. Torhüter, genau. Because they select candidates, because political parties select candidates, in an often very invisible part of the democratic process, they also have the power to keep extremists and demagogues away from power. It's when political parties fail to play their gatekeeping role that democracy gets into trouble. Electoral authoritarians in this new era of democratic, in the way that democracies die today, rarely come to power, though, on their own. They almost always get an assist or help, a helping hand from mainstream political parties and politicians. Around the world, the outside demagogues who threaten democracy usually are political outsiders. They're usually businessmen, former military officials. They are figures who are not part of the political establishment. But seeing these sorts of figures on the horizon, mainstream politicians are often tempted to kind of form a Faustian bargain with these outsiders. And out of miscalculation or out of opportunism, align themselves with the outsiders. And also with the hubristic belief that they can control the outsider. We see this happen over and over. Key lesson of history is that these Faustian bargains usually backfire. So just to give you a couple of examples from an earlier period, in Italy in the 1920s, Giovanni Giletti, the longtime liberal statesman in Italy, saw Mussolini on the horizon in the early 20s and decided to include Mussolini, the outsider's political party, on his party list at election time. Within 2 years, Mussolini was appointed prime minister, and Giletti was long gone. In Weimar, Germany, the DNVP leader, Alfred Hugenberg, the leader of the center-right or right party in Weimar, saw Hitler on the horizon and wanted to, as the DNVP's fate was declining at the end of the 1920s, decided to start issuing joint programs with Hitler's party, held joint rallies with Hitler's party. All of this only helped legitimate Hitler. And Hugenberg's party disintegrated. In early 1933, when Franz von Papen tried to ease the worries of his allies, he is famously quoted as saying to his conservative friends, "Don't worry, within 2 months we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner, he'll squeal." A bigger miscalculation is hard to imagine. The point is, the way electoral authoritarians get in the door is when mainstream politicians, out of opportunism or miscalculation, let them in the door. Now, in the United States, historically, political parties have done a pretty good job, in fact, of keeping demagogues out. This is important to make this point because there was actually no shortage of extremist demagogues in American history. There's often a kind of tendency to whitewash American history by Americans, to kind of assume that American liberal political culture has always insulated the US from this, or the kind of virtues of American voters have prevented this from happening in the United States. But one only has to, just in the 20th century, think in the 1930s, Catholic priest Father Coughlin, who was a radio personality, who had political radio personality, who had tens of millions of listeners. In the 1920s, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, anti-Semitic political ambitions, quoted in the first edition of Hitler's Mein Kampf. Hugely popular in the United States, and considered running for president. In the 1930s, Huey Long, the autocratic governor and senator from Louisiana, a real authoritarian, also hugely popular, had presidential ambitions. In the 1950s, Joseph McCarthy, the red-baiting senator from Wisconsin, was also a nationally popular political figure. In the 1960s, George Wallace, the segregationist governor from Alabama, who was not only popular in the South, but also traveled around the North and in many ways presaged the rise of Richard Nixon, was popular with white working class voters in the North, hugely popular figure. In fact, Gallup poll data, there's Gallup poll data going back to the 1930s, survey data, asking people if you have a favorable or unfavorable view of different politicians. Each of these figures I've just mentioned garnered around 35% approval ratings, going back to the 1930s. So I reject the view, the common view, the popular view, that voters today are somehow becoming more authoritarian, that it's the voters who are to blame, who represent a new threat to democracy. In fact, I think taking this historical view allows us to see that it's really not too much to say that there's really a continuous strand in American political culture, probably as in all countries, of around 35% of the electorate that lends its support to authoritarian demagogic figures. Incidentally, this is around President Trump's sort of support base today. The point, though, that I want to make is that none of these figures, despite being incredibly popular, ever made it close to the presidency. So the question is, why not, and what changed? So we argue in our book that the thing that kept these sorts of figures that I've just mentioned away from the presidency is the way we select our presidential candidates in the United States. So the candidate selection mechanism. Prior to 1972, the American presidential candidates were selected by party leaders at party conventions in what is often criticized, and rightly so, as smoke-filled back rooms. So party leaders got together at party conventions, usually in hotel rooms around the convention hall, where they were drinking whiskey and smoking cigars, hence the smoke-filled back rooms, and deciding who the candidate would be. Now, this system was not very transparent. It wasn't democratic. It was not inclusive. Large segments of the population were excluded from this, but it was quite effective filtration system or mechanism for keeping out demagogues. Party leaders served as gatekeepers. They engaged in what political scientists writing at the time, but of course political scientists would describe it this way, as a system of peer review, where politicians who had seen other politicians up close, had seen them in moments of triumph, had seen them in moments of crisis, and knew who were potential demagogues. They were the ones selecting the leaders. So despite all its shortcomings, and I wouldn't advocate going back to the old smoke-filled room system, this old convention system actually had a perfect record keeping out these sorts of figures from the top of party lists. So these sorts of demagogues often didn't even try to run for office. I'm curious how many of you have read this, the novel, Philip Roth novel, The Plot Against America. Want to recommend it to you. I know it's in German as well. A 2004 novel by the American novelist, The Plot Against America. It's a kind of counterfactual history in which Charles Lindbergh, the American pilot, decides to run for president. And he actually, in fact, did have presidential ambitions for the Republican nomination. He had kind of Nazi sympathies. He was a real right-winger, the original America First, advocate of America First. In the novel, the counterfactual twist is that he actually runs for the nomination, and at the Republican nomination, wins the nomination, runs against Franklin Roosevelt and wins. Now, this story, this novel written in 2004 was quite popular, but then after 2016 became all too imaginable. Of course, in 1940, not only was it not imaginable, it was impossible. Lindbergh's candidacy would have never made it out of the smoke-filled back rooms. It would have never made it through the party gatekeepers. So what happened in 2016? Well, in our book, we argue that two things happened. I mean, there's a lot of focus on voters and which voters and the swing voters who went to Trump. I think in a lot of it, this is all interesting, but really, I think what really happened was, first of all, America's parties adopted a system of binding primaries in 1972. So this is the first part of the story. The primary system, which everybody is familiar with now, in which voters vote, often not even in the party, vote. You have open primaries in some states where voters select the candidate and state by state that extends on and on for a year. This party system was introduced after 1972. It's far more open, far more inclusive than the old system, but it also weakened party leaders' role as gatekeepers. So now if a demagogue like Henry Ford or Charles Lindbergh were to run for president, it would be much harder to keep them out. And that's what we saw in 2016. Donald Trump was the Henry Ford of his day. But whereas party gatekeepers had kept Ford far from the presidency, party gatekeepers didn't have the institutional resources to do this in 2016. So that's the first thing. We could say something about the Democratic Party, and they actually can continue to have a system of superdelegates up until just recently, in which they kind of keep some of the old elements where party leaders have a disproportionate say. But the Republican Party never had this. After 1970, it was much more open, and so the gates were much wider open for a figure like for Donald Trump. Okay, so that's the first part of the story. But that's not the end of the story. Because after Trump's nomination for the presidency, for the Republican Party gatekeepers failed a second time as well. One of the key lessons that Juan Linz, the Spanish political scientist, and other political scientists drew from looking at democratic failures in interwar Europe and in Latin America in the 60s and 70s is that when would-be authoritarians merge, mainstream parties have to do everything in their power while still abiding by democratic rules and norms to keep these figures away from power. Now, of course, resisting a demagogue on one's own side is very difficult. You risk angering the base. It may mean short-term political defeat. And so because of this difficulty, politicians often rationalize, and they tell themselves that supporting the demagogue on their side is actually better than supporting somebody from the other side, because they think they can control the outsider. They think they may be able to ride the demagogue to power to be able to implement their policy goals. And in any case, it's better than handing power to your ideological rival. Again, this is a terrible mistake. And Juan Linz actually made the point very forcefully. He says, when facing a would-be authoritarian, and I'll quote from him, he says, Linz writes, politicians must join with opponents ideologically distant, but committed to the survival of the democratic political order. Now, what's striking about 2015-16 is that Republican leaders openly despised Donald Trump. They thought and said privately he was a demagogue. They thought he was unfit for office. Yet no major leading Republican, elected Republican, did the thing that Juan Linz would have recommended, which is to come to democracy's defense and support somebody from the other side. When somebody on your side violates the litmus test, you have to support somebody from the other side. So not a single prominent Republican elected official endorsed Hillary Clinton. No governors, no senators, no members of Congress. And there were several figures, John McCain included among them, senator from Arizona, who withdrew his endorsement from Trump, but never endorsed the other side. George W. Bush, also didn't endorse Donald Trump, remained silent. All of this, though, sent a critical signal to voters that this was a normal two-party race. And this is a normal Republican against a normal Democrat. And when it's a normal Republican against a normal Democrat, it's about a 50-50 chance who's going to win in a kind of so-so economy. And Donald Trump won. So in case you think it's unrealistic or naive for somebody to support somebody from the other side, I guess I would make this point. That, of course, elected leaders, I'm a political scientist, I understand elected leaders want to gain power. They want to stay in power. This is politics as normal. But in times of genuine democratic crisis, the lesson of history is that politics as normal can be incredibly dangerous. So in the United States, the Republican Party did not do this. And once somebody with arguably authoritarian tendencies is in the door, is in power, it's a changed game. Okay, so the second step then becomes what happens next? For the first time in at least the 20th century, somebody with overtly anti-democratic tendencies is in office, and we've seen the results of this over the past year and a half. I mean, there's a lot of people kind of point out that Donald Trump is not particularly competent, and so we shouldn't worry. But what's clear is that our politics has been turned into this kind of crazy spiral, in part because of his lack of commitment to basic democratic norms. But this is where our democratic political institutions are supposed to come into play. If parties are gatekeepers as a first exit on the road to authoritarianism, a second exit is our institutions. Our institutions, political institutions, and our Constitution were designed exactly to constrain somebody with demagogic tendencies. I mean, these are the terms, in fact, that the founders used when thinking about these issues. Americans place a lot of faith in the U.S. Constitution. I mean, the U.S. Constitution is the oldest written constitution, continuous written constitution in the world. And the system of checks and balances has worked quite well in constraining these similar kinds of tendencies from figures like Andrew Jackson in the 19th century, or Franklin Roosevelt in his efforts to pack the courts and fill up the courts with allies in the 1930s, Richard Nixon. So the question you might be asking yourself, well, aren't these institutions and aren't these systems of checks and balances enough to contain the damage? And in fact, they may be. I mean, this is in a lot of ways the message that a lot of people took from this November election in which the Democrats retook the House of Representatives. The system of Madisonian checks and balances, as people describe it, is working. One of the core messages of our book, though, is that the Constitution by itself is not enough to save us. Constitutions are not self-enacting. They don't just work automatically. If they did, a country like Argentina, which is a country that has a constitution, the 19th century Argentinian constitution, 2/3 of its text is taken directly from the American Constitution. It's a kind of plagiarized document of the American Constitution. If the written words on the page are the thing that matter, then Argentina wouldn't have suffered 6 military coups over the course of the 20th century. So the point is that words on the page aren't enough on their own. And so one of the arguments we make in our book is that constitutions work best, and I think especially presidential constitutions, but constitutions in general work best when they are reinforced by robust democratic norms or unwritten rules, ungeschriebene Regeln. So our book focuses on 2 norms. The first we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of your rivals, your partisan opponents. So this means no matter how much we disagree with or dislike our rivals, we do not treat them as enemies. They have a legitimate right to govern. The second norm is the norm that we call forbearance, Zurückhaltung. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal rights. It's an act of self-restraint or an underutilization of power. Now, we often don't think of forbearance or Zurückhaltung in politics, but it's actually absolutely vital, again, especially in presidential systems. Think about in the US Constitution what the US president can do, according to law. The president can pardon whoever he or she likes at any point for any reason. Totally legal. A president with a congressional majority can increase the size of the Supreme Court. There's no size specified in the US Constitution of how big the court is. If you don't like how the court is making decisions, just add judges to the court, and if you have a majority in the Senate, you can get this through. Perfectly legal. If a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, the president can rule by unilateral executive order. The Constitution puts no limits on this. Or think about what Congress can do. In the United States, the Senate can use what its right of advice and consent, it's called it, the right of advice and consent, which is, they have to give the confirmation to cabinet picks and judges. It could use this right of advice and consent anytime there's a difference in party to block every single appointment of a president. The Congress can refuse to fund the government, shutting the government down. And of course, a topic that's become increasingly relevant, the Congress can decide to impeach the president on any grounds it decides it wants to. All of these things are perfectly legal under the written letter of the law. So the point is that politicians can exploit the letter of the law to eviscerate what we sometimes think of as the spirit of the law. So the legal scholar, Harvard legal law professor Mark Tushnet, has this concept that we use that he calls constitutional hardball. I think we translate this as Verfassungshatebandage or something like that. So this is pushing politics to the max. If you look at any failing or failed democracy around the world in the past or today, you'll find an abundance of, again, constitutional hardball, this kind of maximalist politics. Argentina under Perón, Spain in the 1930s, Venezuela under Chavez, contemporary Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. So this hardball politics is how even brilliantly designed institutions cease to function and how they get subverted. It's how judicial institutions and legislative institutions go from being watchdogs of democracy to essentially being the lapdog of a president. It's what prevents, and what's critical is what prevents a system of checks and balances from descending into constitutional hardball is forbearance, this norm of forbearance. It's a shared commitment among political leaders as well as citizens that it's critical to use restraint when deploying one's institutional prerogatives. So again, think about, to give you a good example, the presidential term limit in the United States. Before 1951, there was no limit on how many terms a president can serve. George Washington, famously, the first president, decided not to run for a third term after his second term in office. Legally, until 1951, presidents could be president for life. And there were many presidents who had big ambitions. Thomas Jefferson, Ulysses S. Grant, Andrew Jackson. There was no law prohibiting this, yet none of these figures ever even decided to ran for a third term. It was an unwritten rule of self-restraint. Similarly, the filibuster, this power of the U.S. Senate to hold up legislation by talking. Technically, a Senate minority, so the minority party, can use this right of filibuster to block everything. But historically, the filibuster was rarely used. There were only 30 filibusters between 1917 and 1960. So this first part of the 20th century, there were only 30 filibusters, less than one a year. So today, that number has exploded. So the point that I want to make here is that norms of mutual toleration on the one hand and norms of forbearance on the other hand are what we call the soft guardrails of democracy. These norms are the things that prevent healthy political competition from descending into gridlock, dysfunction, and democratic crisis. And this is what killed democracy, I would argue, in the 20s and 30s, as well as in the 60s and 70s in Latin America. This is a critical factor. Now, the United States has not always had soft guardrails. It was not born with soft guardrails. It didn't have them in the early years of the Republic. It didn't have them during the Civil War as well. Constitutional hardball was abundant in the 1790s. It was abundant during the Civil War and afterwards. During the 1860s and 70s after the Civil War, both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, viewed each other as existential threats. So there was a presidential impeachment. Supreme Court nominees were blocked. The size of the Supreme Court was changed. So this kind of hardball politics was rampant. And one of the points we make in our book is that for very tragic reasons that are really critical for understanding American democracy, beginning in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans began to regard each other no longer as existential enemies, and as legitimate, and they began to avoid these destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. In particular, what happened was beginning around the 1890s, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, gave up on the cause of racial equality, gave up on its full commitment to equal political rights for African Americans. So as a result of this, Southern Democrats no longer regarded Republicans as existential threats. And so a kind of tragic truce was achieved where mutual toleration was restored. Forbearance reemerged. And again, this tragic irony that we live with today in the United States is that these two critical norms that are building blocks of a stable democracy, mutual toleration and forbearance, these are preconditions for democracy, I would argue, these were achieved at the price of racial exclusion. So what this means is that our democracy was fundamentally incomplete. But this also meant that constitutional hardball diminished over the course of the 20th century. So in the 20th century, there were no impeachments or successful court packings. Senators were now increasingly judicious in their use of the filibuster, and outside of wartime, presidents didn't rule by executive order. So our famous system of checks and balances now worked over the course of the 20th century. But again, they worked because they were reinforced by these norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. So we show in our book that these norms have been eroding over the last 25 years. We've seen this, of course, expand dramatically in the last 2 years, but it's important to recognize that the decline of forbearance and mutual toleration began long before Donald Trump. We argue that it began really in earnest in the 1990s. And we we kind of tell the history of this story in our book, and we make the case that Newt Gingrich, who was the first Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives from Georgia, beginning in 1995, was one of the first political actors who launched this politics of constitutional hardball. He instructed his Republican allies when talking about Democrats, very consciously, they distributed tapes for people to listen to, Republicans to listen to, kind of talking points for people his Republican members of Congress to listen to, that when they talk about Democrats, always use the word betray, use the word anti-flag, use the word anti-family, use the word traitor whenever you talk about Democrats. Gingrich was also the master of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first government shutdown in the 1990s. his party organized the partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton in the 1990s. It was the first presidential impeachment in 130 years. This process of norm erosion, though, really accelerated in the 2000s. During the Obama era, the Tea Party movement in the United States radicalized the Republican Party, encouraging them to abandon mutual toleration. So there were a whole series of Republican leaders, Mike Huckabee, Rudy Giuliani, Sarah Palin, the vice presidential candidate, told their followers that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats weren't real Americans. The birther movement, the so-called birther movement, which Donald Trump was a leader of, which questioned Barack Obama's the validity of his birth certificate, went a step further in a sense because you have to have been born in the United States to be president, questioning President Obama's very legitimacy as president. Let me just give you an example of the kind of rhetoric from one congressman, Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman declared in the mid-2000s, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States, but I do know this. In his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American." Hillary Clinton received similar treatment. At the Republican convention in 2016, on live national television, Republicans, for all to see, chanted, lock her up, challenging once again her basic legitimacy to run for office. Now, I've noted already that America has always had an extremist fringe of politics, but this was no longer fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. This was the vice presidential candidate in 2012 accusing the presidential candidate of being sympathetic to terrorists. This is the Republican National Convention on live national television. Leading Republicans were now questioning the legitimacy of their political opponents. Now, this is particularly worrying because in the absence of mutual toleration, if you regard your rivals as enemies, politicians are tempted to abandon forbearance and engage in this kind of escalating spiral of constitutional hardball. When we view our partisan rivals as enemies, we view them as existential threats, then of course we'll use any means necessary to block them from getting to power. And that's really exactly what has begun to happen in the 2000s. Politicians began to throw forbearance to the wind. So when Republicans retook the Congress in 2010, they adopted very explicitly a strategy of outright obstructionism. They basically wanted to said explicitly that they wanted to end Obama's presidency as quickly as possible. So filibuster use, which I've referred to a couple of times already, which was already increasing, in part led by Democrats in the mid-2000s, really skyrocketed. There were actually more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in every year combined between World War I and the end of the Reagan presidency. President Obama, when faced with this, also adopted strategies of constitutional hardball. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform or climate change reform, he circumvented this and made policy by executive order. If you want to know why it was so easy for Donald Trump to undo climate agreements, it's because President Obama had achieved these only through executive orders, meaning they could also be undone via executive order. By the end of the Obama presidency, Republicans seemed to really be willing to use any means necessary to prevent the Democrats from winning. So in 15 Republican governed states, so the state election laws are organized at the state level, 15 states adopted strict voter laws, voter ID laws, which all experts agree that are really intended to disenfranchise voters. In North Carolina, after the 2016 election, when the governorship passed from a Republican to a Democrat, the Republican legislature in North Carolina, in between, this is something that's actually happening in Wisconsin now as well, held a surprise special session that was intended to weaken the powers of the governor, the incoming Democratic governor. So again, this kind of constitutional hardball has continued just in recent weeks as well. Actually, in West Virginia earlier this year, the entire Supreme Court was impeached by the Republican state legislature because some of the justices were using computers, they thought, inappropriately, or using public computer for private purposes. In Wisconsin, something similar has happened. I'll come back to that in a moment, since November. But actually, at the national level, the most stunning thing, I think, of all is that is the process of when President Obama, when Justice Scalia died, the Supreme Court justice died, President Obama had the ability to name a Supreme Court justice, and he would have been voted on. But the Republican Party refused to even hold hearings for President Obama's nominee. This is the first time this had happened since the 19th century. This is since 1866, since the Civil War, after the Civil War. So all of these developments that I'm talking about all happened before Donald Trump or independent of Donald Trump. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. It's the United States elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails of protecting American democracy are corroding. Okay, so why is this happening? Why is this happening? We argue in our book that what's driving norm erosion in the United States, and this is a kind of set of insights that travel, I think, beyond the United States, is partisan polarization. So I'll talk about what this looks like in the United States. Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe one another. In 1960, 5% of Republicans said they would be displeased if their child married somebody of another political party. Actually, the survey was done in Germany, too. I forget what those figures are. Was much higher. In 1960, 5%. In 2010, that survey was done again. That number is now 50%. According to a recent Pew survey, 45% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats say the other party's policies make them afraid. 49% say that these policies threaten the nation's well-being. So we haven't seen this kind of partisan hatred in the United States since the 19th century. And this isn't just traditional liberal conservative policy differentiation. People don't fear and loathe each other over taxes and health care. Today's partisan differences are much deeper. They are about race, religion, and way of life. Our parties have changed dramatically in the United States over the last 50 years. In the 1960s and the 1970s, Republican and Democratic parties were culturally actually quite similar. If you look back in the early 1960s, there were huge policy differences, of course, but demographically, the party's leadership were overwhelmingly white and Christian. Three big changes have occurred over the last half century. First, the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1965 led to the democratization of the United States, but also led to a gradual migration of Southern Democrats, conservative Southern Democrats, to the Republican Party. Conservative white Southern Democrats to the Republican Party. And African Americans overwhelmingly became Democratic. Second, the U.S. experienced a massive increase in immigration beginning after the 1960s. Immigration reform passed in the mid-1960s, and most of these immigrants ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, by the time of Ronald Reagan, partly in response to the abortion issue in the United States, evangelical Christians, Christians, I have to move around more. Sorry. Overwhelmingly ended up in the Republican Party. Until the 1980s, they were evenly divided between the two parties. By the 1980s, they were in the Republican Party. So what all of this means is that today, the Republican and the Democratic parties look incredibly different. They're racially and culturally incredibly distinct. The Democrats are essentially a kind of rainbow coalition of urban and educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. Over 40% of Democratic voters are non-white. The Republican Party, by contrast, remains overwhelmingly white and Christian. Now, this is important because, of course, white Christians aren't just any group. They were once the majority, and they used to sit unchallenged atop the political, cultural, economic, social hierarchies of the United States. They filled the presidency, the Congress, the governor's mansions. They were the newscasters, the sports stars, and the college professors. Those days are long gone. But losing one's status can be incredibly challenging. Losing one's majority can be incredibly challenging. Many Republican voters report, not all, but many report that they feel like their country is being taken away from them. This is what we argue, we think is ultimately what's fueling polarization. Now, the problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracies. I mean, some policy differentiation, of course, is important. but extreme polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson from the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, and I would argue the 20s and 30s in Europe. When politics is so deeply polarized that you view a victory by the other side as beyond the pale, it's just unacceptable, then democracy is in trouble. There's some interesting research by a political scientist at Yale, Milan Svolik, who did a survey originally in Venezuela, tapping into trying to measure people's sense of polarization and what they think of democratic violations. And what he found is that if the greater the distance in these surveys that he's done, if you think the other side is further from you, you're more willing to, ideologically, you're more willing to overlook democratic violations on your own side. He originally did this survey in Venezuela. He's also now done the survey in the United States, a kind of initial, he's expanding this, but essentially that you're willing to look over violations on your side if you're fearful of the other side. This is dangerous because when an opposition victory is viewed, again, as intolerable, you start justifying extraordinary measures, manipulating election rules, election fraud, violence, military coups. I mean, certainly the United States has not reached that level. But we have reached a point where, according to exit surveys in 2016, in the presidential election in 2016, 1 out of every 4 Trump voters, these are 1 out of every 4 people who voted for Donald Trump, said he was unfit for office. Yet they still preferred him to the Democratic candidate. There's been Gallup surveys that show that Republican voters, at least according to these surveys, have a more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than of Hillary Clinton. These are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He's not just a cause of it. And his departure won't put an end to it. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Aren't our Madison institutions working? Isn't that what the midterm elections taught us? You know, the schizophrenia that I talked about, I think everybody, it's a collective schizophrenia and an individual schizophrenia that everybody feels, I think. But I think what is true, the midterm elections, you know, people breathe the collective sigh of relief on both sides, just to have this kind of constraint built into the system. And I think the U.S. is less likely, much less likely now than it ever was, and even if than to experience something kind of like a majoritarian imposition. I mean, something like what we see in Hungary, where a majority re-rigs the rules so they maintain their majority status, a kind of authoritarian imposition. And the U.S. is certainly not going down that path. But divided government, where parties control different branches of government, in a presidential system in particular, runs a great risk, a different kind of risk of a constitutional crisis. In presidential systems like the United States or in Latin America, divided government, where different parties control different branches of government, in principle can lead to checks and balances. That's what we normally think. It leads to checks and balances where each side constrains the other. But this only works when norms of mutual toleration and forbearance are present. When these norms are dissolving, divided government, where different parties control different branches of government, can lead to constitutional hardball, deadlock, gridlock, dysfunction, and institutional warfare. So if you look to the United States, and I mentioned Wisconsin earlier, in 2016, the story that I told of a Republican governor being voted out and then the Republican legislature, after the fact, trying to change the rules of the power of the governor. Similar thing is happening right now in Wisconsin after the 2018 election, where a Republican governor was voted out of office. The new Democratic governor comes into office in January, and in the intervening month, when everybody's supposed to be enjoying Christmas and not really working too much, they're busy at work changing the powers of the governor so that the Democratic governor can't change the law in ways that actually he should be able to. Similar dynamics are at work in Michigan. So we're seeing this kind of institutional warfare at the level of states. And it's worth emphasizing it's asymmetric. I mean, this is happening in Republican states where Republican government, closely fought states where Republicans are losing control. And I think there's the possibility we may, in a divided government at the national level, we could see similar levels of this kind of institutional warfare. In the absence of forbearance, a kind of new escalation between the branches of government that can lead to instability and has, in other parts of the world, led to democratic breakdown is possible. Okay, so a final point I think I'll end on is how should the Democratic Party respond to this? I put a lot of the blame here on the Republican Party. We've been criticized by that by some Republicans. Why not be more even-handed? We're social scientists. We look at the evidence, and I think most of the evidence does. The burden lays mostly on the Republican Party. But how should the Democratic Party respond to this? Well, one thing that's an interesting debate that's happening right now is that there's increasing pressure in progressive circles that Democrats ought to learn to fight like Republicans. If Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, then Democrats need to do the same. They need to respond tit for tat. If they don't, Democrats will be the victims of an endless series of punches beneath the belt, when one side's playing by the rules and the other isn't. And actually, a book has recently come out called It's Time to Fight Dirty, that basically makes the argument that Democrats, if they regain the Senate and the presidency, need to expand the Supreme Court. That no matter what the investigation that's unfolding right now, if President Trump returns, President Trump should be impeached immediately. That may be justified ultimately, but without regard to the report. I think this general response of having Democrats learning to fight like Republicans is a response that worries us. It's another turn in the spiral. If Democrats respond with constitutional hardball, it will almost certainly reinforce this spiral. And when we look around the world, we see that this usually doesn't end well. And when both sides are playing in this escalating tit for tat. Now, again, I understand that Democrats are under lots of pressure to do this, but this is a kind of interesting point, I think, that Republicans are operating with very short time horizons. This is an argument that David Frum, the Republican speechwriter, has made this point in his book, Trumpocracy, that the norm-breaking, vote-rigging, trying to lock in advantages in the courts are in effect a desperate effort to preserve power given that the Republican Party demographically in the medium run and the long run does not have a bright future. That's what I think we're witnessing, in fact, in Wisconsin and other states. Democrats, by contrast, have a much better medium-term and long-term prospects, given their demographic makeup. So the greatest threat to Democrats today is by escalating the conflicts that puts these institutions at risk. So Democrats need to somehow learn to fight hard, and this requires political skill, but not break rules. And this is really important, and it's kind of to step back more broadly to think about this. When we think about the crisis of democracy around the world, we often implicitly in our heads have this metaphor that we're using, which is that the crisis of democracy is something like global warming. It's something that's rising tides of disaffection, dissatisfaction, dysfunction, and that the process is inexorable, that it's moving in one direction, that the old rules no longer apply, that desperate measures are needed to stop it. I believe that's the case for global warming. I'm not sure that's the case for the crisis of democracy. I would like to suggest a different metaphor from the natural world. Maybe the crisis of democracy is much more like an earthquake. Earthquakes come and go. They've happened in the past, they'll happen in the future, they may be happening now. The critical question in an earthquake is how well built are our institutions to withstand the shocks for life during the earthquake and for life after the earthquake. We have to make sure our institutions are strong enough. And to do this, we cannot play constitutional hardball with our institutions. There's simply too much at stake. Thank you.